Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corin. So I'm very much enjoying listening to the episodes of this podcast. This has been a week of putting stuff together. We were working on the home server, and I'm now looking at the monitor mounts. And between this and getting ready for the eventual move we'll do in a few months, there's a lot of time spent with boxes and tools. And that's part of the reason that I've really been working on creating a very rich episode history. My pace of writing prompts at the moment is quicker than listening, but I do listen to a few episodes each day, and I really enjoy it. So as you know, Herman and Corin, I'm a man with quite a number of tech components, but as often happens, you have not quite the right thing for the job. I'm talking about audio and specifically speakers. So this room we're currently in is about 7x4, and Hannah, as you know, is also fond of the podcast, and sometimes we like to listen jointly to episodes. So I have this Bluetooth speaker. I'm looking at it currently. It's a Sony SBS X10 or something of that nature, and it's decent for what I use it for. Like if you're, I think I got it when I was traveling. So if you're like, you want to put a little Bluetooth speaker next to your computer and listen to a movie or something, it's decent enough for that. I thought at a stretch it could maybe fill the room, but it doesn't really fill the room. The other thing I have is a kind of ridiculous PA speaker that's more of comic value than anything, but it's kind of overpowered. So what I'm looking for, Herman and Corin, is your advice upon a type of speaker that would be great for listening to podcasts. So in other words, we're talking about audio or vocal frequencies rather than music necessarily, but preferably can do both, but with a focus on nice EQ out of the box for the spoken word, and which would do a good job at filling a wide space without necessarily blasting a lot of sound, because living in apartments, we don't want to be perpetually, and you don't need, when you're listening to podcasts, I think it's not really about loudness, it's more about how far and wide that fills. So if we were to draw an analogy to microphones we've talked about before, we talked about an omnidirectional microphone having a round 360-degree pickup pattern, and that's what I'm actually looking for in a speaker. Think a speaker you can place in the center of a room or a living space and have it kind of radiate in all directions so that you can do whatever you want, whatever you're doing, and the audio is kind of pretty much at an equal volume. What do you think, Herman and Corin, would be a good type of speaker? Let's firstly talk about the speaker type. What are we looking for in the spec sheet? And any particular products that come to your mind that might be good for this kind of thing. Over to you two.
You know, Herman, I was just looking at the corner of the room where we have that old bookshelf speaker, and I realized something. We spend so much time worrying about how we sound going into the microphones, but we rarely talk about the other end of the chain, how people are actually hearing us in their own homes. We obsess over the bit depth, the sample rate, and the specific diaphragm material of our microphones. But then we send that signal out into the wild where it might be played back on anything from a high-end hi-fi system to a cracked smartphone screen sitting in a cup holder.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are absolutely right, Corin. The reproduction side is half the battle. It is the final frontier of the audio experience. You can have the best signal path in the world, a pristine recording environment, and a $5,000 preamp, but if it is coming out of a tiny tinny speaker, all that nuance we work so hard on just disappears. The warmth of the low mids, the crispness of the transients, the subtle room tone that gives a podcast its sense of place, all of it gets flattened into a thin metallic soup if the playback hardware is not up to the task.
It is funny you say that because Daniel's prompt today is specifically about that final stage. He is looking for a speaker that is optimized for listening to podcasts. He wants something that focuses on vocal frequencies, has a great EQ out of the box for the spoken word, and can fill a wide space without being too loud for an apartment. And the kicker is, he wants it to be omnidirectional. He wants to be able to move around his living room, maybe head into the kitchen for a snack, and not feel like he has stepped out of the soundstage.
Oh, I love this. This is such a specific and honestly very sophisticated set of requirements. Most people just go out and buy whatever has the most bass or whatever is on sale at the big box store. They want that thump, thump, thump that rattles the windows. But if you are a heavy podcast listener, your needs are totally different from someone who just wants to blast electronic dance music or watch action movies with explosions. You are looking for intimacy, clarity, and consistency. You want the host to sound like they are sitting across the table from you, not like they are shouting from inside a cardboard box.
Exactly. And I think the apartment living aspect is a huge factor. You want that clarity and that room-filling presence, but you do not want your neighbors banging on the wall because your subwoofer is vibrating their floorboards. It is about the efficiency of the sound, not just the raw volume. So, Herman, let's start with the basics. When someone like Daniel says they want a speaker focused on vocal frequencies, what does that actually mean in terms of hardware and tuning? How do you build a speaker that loves voices?
Well, it starts with the frequency response. For music, we often talk about that classic V-shaped curve, which is sometimes called the smiley face EQ. That is where the bass is boosted and the high-end treble is boosted, leaving the middle a bit recessed. That sounds exciting for rock or pop because it emphasizes the kick drum and the shimmer of the cymbals. But it is the exact opposite of what you want for voices. Human speech lives primarily in the mid-range. We are talking about the area between 80 Hz and maybe 8 kHz. But the real meat of the conversation, the part that gives a voice its character and intelligibility, is usually between 500 Hz and 3 kHz.
So, if a speaker is tuned for music, it might actually be making voices harder to understand. It is essentially burying the lead.
Precisely. If the bass is too heavy, the low-end frequencies can mask the delicate consonant sounds. Think about the letters T, K, and S. Those are higher frequency sounds, often called sibilants. If the speaker is busy pumping out a thick, boomy bass line, or even just a very warm, low-mid resonance around 200 Hz, those consonants get buried. You end up turning the volume up just to understand what someone is saying, and then suddenly the bass is too loud for the apartment. You are in this constant battle with the volume knob because the balance is all wrong for the content.
That makes a lot of sense. It is that struggle of constantly reaching for the remote because the voices are too quiet, but the sound effects or music are too loud. I have been there, especially with some of those high-production audio dramas where the sound design is incredible, but the dialogue gets lost in the mix. So, for a podcast-first speaker, we are looking for something with a very flat or even slightly mid-forward response. Something that prioritizes the 1 kHz to 4 kHz range where the human ear is most sensitive to speech.
Right, and Daniel mentioned EQ out of the box. What he is really looking for is a speaker with a high-quality digital signal processor, or DSP. Modern speakers use these chips to constantly adjust the output in real time. Some speakers even have a dedicated speech enhancement mode. It is a bit like a compressor and an equalizer working together. It looks at the incoming signal, identifies the vocal frequencies, and ensures they stay at a consistent level relative to everything else. It can even reduce the dynamic range slightly so that a whisper and a shout are both audible without you having to touch the volume.
Okay, let's talk about the omnidirectional requirement. Daniel wants to be able to place this in the center of a room and have the audio be at an equal volume wherever he is. That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually achieve that without it sounding like a muddy mess? Normally, if you are not in front of a speaker, it sounds like you are listening through a wall.
It is a fascinating engineering challenge. Most speakers are directional. They have a tweeter and a woofer pointing straight at you. If you move to the side, you lose the high frequencies first because they are very directional. They travel in straight lines. Low frequencies are more omnidirectional by nature, which is why you can hide a subwoofer under a couch, but you cannot hide a tweeter. To make a truly omnidirectional speaker, you usually see one of two designs. Either a series of drivers arranged in a circle pointing outward in all directions, or an upward firing driver that hits an acoustic lens.
An acoustic lens? That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. Is that like a laser for sound?
It is actually quite elegant. Imagine a cone-shaped piece of plastic or metal suspended directly above a speaker driver that is pointing straight up. When the sound waves hit that cone, they are reflected outward in a 360-degree pattern. It spreads the sound evenly across a horizontal plane. This is fantastic for Daniel's use case because it eliminates the sweet spot. You do not have to be sitting directly in front of the speaker to get the full frequency range. Whether you are standing in the corner of the room or sitting right next to it, the tonal balance remains relatively consistent.
I can see how that would be perfect for someone moving around their apartment, doing chores, or working at different stations. But does that omnidirectional spread make it harder to control the volume for neighbors? If the sound is going everywhere, isn't it more likely to bleed through the walls?
That is the trade-off. In a traditional directional setup, you are aiming the sound at your ears. In an omnidirectional setup, you are intentionally bouncing sound off every wall in the room to create that uniform field. However, because the sound is so evenly distributed, you often find you can keep the overall volume lower. You do not have to crank it up to hear it from the kitchen if the speaker is in the living room because the sound is already radiating toward the kitchen. It reduces the need for high volume peaks to overcome distance.
That is a great point. It is about efficiency of coverage rather than raw power. It is like the difference between a spotlight and a lantern. The spotlight is brighter in one spot, but the lantern makes the whole room usable. So, if Daniel is looking at a spec sheet, what are the red flags or the green flags he should be hunting for?
Green flag number 1 is a multi-driver array. If a speaker only has one single full-range driver, it is going to struggle to do everything well. It will likely be a jack of all trades and a master of none. You want at least a dedicated tweeter and a woofer, or even better, a series of them. For omnidirectional specifically, look for mentions of 360-degree sound or acoustic deflectors. Another big green flag is room calibration. This is huge for 2026.
Like the systems that use your phone's microphone to listen to the room? I have seen that on some of the newer smart speakers.
Exactly. Apple calls it room sensing. Sonos calls it TruePlay. Because Daniel wants to put this in the center of a wide space, the speaker needs to understand the acoustics of that space. It will send out a series of pings, listen to how they bounce off the walls, and then adjust its own EQ to compensate for any weird echoes or bass buildup. For an apartment dweller, this is a godsend. It can literally dial back the frequencies that are likely to vibrate through your walls while boosting the ones that help you hear the host clearly. It is basically an automated sound engineer living inside your speaker.
What about the red flags? What should make Daniel close the browser tab immediately?
Red flag number 1 is anything that brags about massive bass or passive radiators without mentioning mid-range clarity. If the marketing is all about feeling the thump or shaking the floor, it is probably not the speaker for my weird prompts. Also, be wary of very small speakers that claim to be omnidirectional. Often, they are just using a single driver pointing up, and without a sophisticated acoustic lens or DSP, they just sound muffled and muddy. You lose all that crispness in the voices. Another red flag is a lack of Wi-Fi connectivity. If it is Bluetooth only, you are going to deal with more compression and potential range issues in a wide apartment.
So, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the actual products on the market right now, in early 2026, that fit this bill? I have a few in mind, but I want to hear your expert take first. What is the gold standard right now?
Well, we have to talk about the Apple HomePod, specifically the second generation. I know, it is a very ecosystem-locked choice, but from a pure engineering standpoint, it is a marvel for what Daniel wants. It has a high excursion woofer pointing up, and a ring of 5 horn-loaded tweeters around the base. It is essentially an omnidirectional array by design.
And those tweeters are key, right? Because they can steer the sound.
Precisely. It uses beamforming. It actually senses where the walls are and can direct the primary vocals into the center of the room while using the walls for reflected ambient sound. For podcasts, it is incredibly clear. Apple's computational audio is very aggressive about making sure voices are front and center. It has a very natural, almost eerie clarity for the spoken word. If you are an iPhone user, it is hard to beat the seamlessness of it.
I have noticed that with the HomePod. Sometimes it feels like the person is standing in the room with you. But what if Daniel isn't an Apple user? Or what if he wants something a bit more flexible that works with everything?
Then we look at the Sonos Era 300. This is a very interesting beast. It was designed primarily for spatial audio and Dolby Atmos, but that same driver layout makes it an incredible omnidirectional performer. It has drivers pointing left, right, up, and forward. When you play a mono or stereo podcast through it, it uses its processing to fill the room in a very sophisticated way. And Sonos has some of the best speech enhancement toggles in the business.
I love the Sonos app for that. You can just tap a little speech bubble icon and it instantly tweaks the EQ to prioritize those vocal frequencies we talked about. It is perfect for when you are listening at lower volumes in an apartment. It basically does the hard work of an EQ for you with one tap.
Exactly, and their TruePlay calibration is very effective, especially if you have a weirdly shaped room or lots of hard surfaces like hardwood floors or big windows. Now, if Daniel wants something that is truly 360 degrees in a physical sense, the Bose SoundLink Revolve Plus Series 2 is still a very strong contender. It looks like a little lantern, and it uses a single downward firing transducer hitting an omnidirectional acoustic deflector.
Bose has a reputation for that very processed, very clean sound. Is that a good thing for podcasts? Some audiophiles turn their noses up at it.
In this case, yes. Bose is famous for their psychoacoustic tricks. They know how to make a small speaker sound much larger than it is, and they prioritize a very smooth mid-range. It is a very non-fatiguing listen. You could listen to a 3-hour deep dive episode on that speaker and your ears wouldn't get tired. It is also portable, which is a nice bonus, though Daniel mentioned placing it in the center of a room. It is rugged too, so if he knocks it over while moving around, it is not the end of the world.
What about the higher end? If he really wants to invest in a piece of furniture that also happens to be a world-class speaker, something that looks as good as it sounds.
Then we have to talk about Bang & Olufsen. The Biosound 2 is essentially the gold standard for what Daniel is describing. It is a conical piece of aluminum that looks like a piece of art. It has a 3/4-inch tweeter at the top pointing down into an acoustic lens, 2 mid-range drivers in the middle, and a large woofer at the bottom. It is truly omnidirectional, and the way it handles the mid-range is just sublime. It is expensive, certainly, but it is one of the few speakers that truly masters the physics of 360-degree sound without relying entirely on DSP tricks. It is pure acoustic engineering.
I remember seeing one of those. It is striking. It looks like something from a mid-century modern dream. But let's go back to the spec sheet for a second. Daniel mentioned he wants to fill a wide space without being too loud. We talked about coverage, but what about the actual decibel levels? Is there a spec for how well a speaker performs at low volumes? Because some speakers sound great when they are loud, but they lose all their character when you turn them down.
That is a great question, Korn. It is a concept called the Fletcher-Munson curves, or equal loudness contours. Our ears are not linear. As the volume goes down, we lose our ability to hear bass and high-end detail much faster than we lose the mid-range. This is why things sound thin when they are quiet. A good speaker for an apartment listener will have a feature often called loudness compensation.
I remember there being a physical button on old 70s receivers. My dad had one with a big silver toggle for loudness.
It was, and it was there for a reason. Modern DSP does this automatically now. It boosts the lows and highs slightly when you are listening at low volumes, so that the sound still feels full and balanced. When Daniel is looking at speakers, he should check if they have an auto loudness feature or a night mode. Night mode is particularly great for podcasts because it compresses the dynamic range. It brings the quietest whispers up and the loudest shouts down, so everything stays in that golden zone of intelligibility without waking up the neighbors. It prevents those sudden jumps in volume that can be so jarring in an apartment.
That is such a vital feature. I think people often forget that podcasts can have very inconsistent volumes, especially if they are recorded on location or have multiple guests with different mic techniques. One person is leaning into the mic, the other is 3 feet away. Having the speaker handle that leveling for you is a huge quality of life improvement. It saves you from being the human volume limiter.
Absolutely. Now, I want to touch on something Daniel mentioned about placing the speaker in the center of the room. This is the ideal for an omnidirectional speaker, but it is also the most challenging for bass. When a speaker is against a wall, the wall acts as a boundary and boosts the bass. When it is in the middle of the room, you lose that boundary gain.
So we might actually find that he needs a speaker with a bit more low-end capability than he initially thought, just to compensate for the central placement. It is like the room is eating the bass.
Exactly. He shouldn't be afraid of a speaker with a decent-sized woofer. He just needs to make sure he has the control to dial it back if it becomes too much. This is where a good app-based EQ comes in. If he places a HomePod or a Sonos in the center of the room and it sounds a bit thin, he can just bump the bass up a notch or two in the settings. This is why we recommend speakers with robust software support. You want that granular control.
We have covered a lot of ground here, from the physics of acoustic lenses to the specifics of DSP. If we were to give Daniel a checklist of things to look for when he is out shopping or browsing online, what would be the top 3 items? Let's boil it down for him.
Number 1. Look for a speaker with dedicated mid-range drivers or a sophisticated tweeter array. Avoid single driver solutions if you can help it, as they often lack the clarity needed for complex speech. Number 2. Ensure it has some form of active room calibration. In a wide, open space, the room is going to have a massive impact on the sound, and you want the speaker to be smart enough to fix its own mistakes. And number 3. Check for a speech enhancement or night mode in the software. That is going to be your best friend for late night listening in an apartment. It is the difference between hearing every word and just hearing a muffled drone.
That is a solid list. And I would add a 4th, connectivity. If you are listening to podcasts, you want it to be easy to hand off from your phone to the speaker. Look for AirPlay 2, Chromecast built in, or Spotify Connect. Bluetooth is okay in a pinch, but for high-quality audio and better range around a wide apartment, those Wi-Fi based protocols are much better. They also don't interrupt your audio if you get a notification or a phone call.
Good point, Korn. Bluetooth can sometimes compress the audio, and while that might not matter for a low bitrate podcast, if you are listening to a high production show with lots of sound design, you will definitely hear the difference. Plus, Wi-Fi allows the speaker to pull the stream directly from the internet, which saves your phone's battery and means the audio won't cut out if you walk into another room with your phone in your pocket. In 2026, Wi-Fi is the standard for a reason.
So, let's talk about the specific frequencies again. You mentioned 8 kHz as the upper end of speech. If Daniel sees a speaker that claims to go up to 40 kHz, is that just a waste for him? Is he paying for performance he can't even use?
For podcasts, almost entirely. That is high-resolution audio territory, mostly for dogs and bats to enjoy. However, a speaker that can accurately reproduce up to 20 kHz will generally have a more effortless sound in the upper mids. It means the tweeter isn't straining to hit those vocal sibilants. So, while he doesn't need a super tweeter, he does want a speaker that is rated for the full human hearing range, which is 20 Hz to 20 kHz. It gives the audio room to breathe.
And on the low end, how low does he really need to go for a voice? We don't want it to be thin, but we don't want it to rattle the floorboards.
A deep male voice can have fundamentals as low as 80 or even 70 Hz. If a speaker rolls off at 150 Hz, that voice is going to sound thin and tinny. It will lose its authority and its natural warmth. So, he should look for something that can at least hit 60 Hz cleanly. That will give the voices enough body to feel natural without being so low that it starts vibrating the structural elements of his apartment. It is about finding that sweet spot of resonance.
It is such a delicate balance. It is almost like we are looking for a studio monitor that has been disguised as a piece of home decor. We want the accuracy of a professional tool with the aesthetics of a living room.
That is exactly what a good modern smart speaker is. The engineers at these companies are using the same principles we use in the studio time alignment, phase correction, and frequency smoothing, but they are applying them to these consumer devices. It is a great time to be an audio nerd because the gap between professional gear and consumer gear is shrinking every year.
It really is. I remember back in episode 422 when we talked about the history of radio speakers and how they were all basically designed for mid-range because that was all the technology could handle. We have come full circle, but now we have the processing power to make that mid-range sound incredible while still having the option for full-range fidelity. We have the best of both worlds now.
We really have, and it is worth noting that for a wide space, Daniel might even consider a pair of speakers. I know he asked for one omnidirectional speaker, but 2 speakers placed strategically can sometimes create a more even sound field than 1 speaker in the middle. However, if he is set on that central totem-style placement, the omnidirectional route is definitely the way to go for that consistent experience.
There is something very satisfying about a single point source of sound, though. It feels more like a real person is in the room talking to you, rather than a disembodied stereo image. It has a certain presence that can be very comforting, especially with long-form conversational podcasts.
I agree. There is a psychological component to it. Our brains are very good at localizing voices. If a voice is coming from two different speakers, your brain has to do a little bit of extra work to fuse them into one person. With the single omnidirectional speaker, that localization is much more natural. It feels like the host is just standing right there in the room with you.
So, Herman, if you were in Daniel's shoes, living in an apartment, wanting to fill a large room with the dulcet tones of your favorite podcast brothers, which one would you actually buy? If you had to pull the trigger today, February 20th, 2026.
If I were an iPhone user, it would be the HomePod, no question. The way it integrates with the environment and the sheer quality of the vocal reproduction for the price is hard to beat. It is a very smart piece of hardware. But if I wanted something that felt a bit more like a high-end audio component and I wasn't tied to one ecosystem, I would save up for that Bang & Olufsen Biosound 2. It is a lifetime purchase. It is beautiful, the build quality is insane, and the acoustic lens technology is just so effective at what it does. It is a piece of art that happens to be a great speaker. What about you, Korn?
I think I would lean toward the Sonos Era 300. I love the flexibility of the Sonos ecosystem, and the fact that I can add a smaller speaker in the bathroom or the bedroom later and have them all perfectly synced is a huge plus. And, as we mentioned, that speech enhancement toggle is basically a cheat code for podcast listeners. It is so simple and so effective. Plus, the Era 300 has a bit more connectivity flexibility than the HomePod.
It really is a great choice. You know, we should probably mention that no matter what speaker he gets, placement is going to be 50% of the battle. Even an omnidirectional speaker shouldn't be placed directly on a glass coffee table or tucked inside a bookshelf. You have to give it room to breathe.
Oh, definitely. Glass is a nightmare for reflections. It will make everything sound harsh and brittle. It adds this high-frequency zing that is very fatiguing. A solid wood surface, or even a dedicated speaker stand, is much better. And if it is in the center of the room, make sure it is at roughly ear level when you are sitting down. You don't want it on the floor firing at your ankles, and you don't want it on top of a high cabinet firing over your head.
Exactly. Sound is a physical wave. You have to give it a clear path to your ears. If you put it behind a couch or under a table, you are just throwing money away. You are essentially muffling the very clarity you paid for. Think of it like a lamp. You wouldn't put a lamp under a bucket and expect it to light the room.
Well, I think we've given Daniel plenty to chew on. From frequency curves to acoustic lenses, he is now equipped to navigate the spec sheets like a pro. He can go into that store or browse those sites with confidence.
I hope so. It is a fun journey to go on. Finding that perfect piece of gear that makes your daily habits more enjoyable is one of life's great small pleasures. It changes the way you interact with your favorite shows.
Absolutely. And hey, if any of our listeners have found a hidden gem of a speaker that we didn't mention, we would love to hear about it. Maybe there is a boutique brand out there doing something incredible with omnidirectional sound. Or, if you have your own weird prompt for us to dive into, you can always reach out.
Yeah, we love hearing from you all. It is what keeps the show going. Speaking of which, if you are enjoying my weird prompts and you have been listening for a while, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether it is Apple Podcasts or Spotify, those ratings really help new people find the show and join our little community here. It helps the algorithm realize that we are actually talking about something useful.
It genuinely makes a big difference. We see every one of them, and it means a lot to us. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com, where we have our full archive of over 700 episodes, an RSS feed for subscribers, and a contact form. We have been doing this for a long time, and we have no plans of stopping.
And you can always email us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you can find audio. We are even on some of those obscure platforms that only 3 people use.
Well, this has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone. Keep those prompts coming.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.